Everything happened in just a few days. A triumphant entry, a silent betrayal, an unjust trial, and a cross that would change history forever. But the question is unavoidable. What really happened on each of those days? What many people know as Holy Week is not just a tradition or a series of religious celebrations. It is a real sequence of events, recorded in the Bible, where every moment carries a clear purpose, every decision has consequences, and every step leads Jesus closer to the cross. And when you begin to look at these days in order, something remarkable happens. Because nothing was improvised, nothing was accidental. From his entry into Jerusalem to his death, everything followed a path that was already unfolding, even when those around him didn't fully understand it. The crowd that shouted "Hosanna" had no idea how that week would end. Religious leaders were already uneasy, and behind the scenes, decisions were being made. Meanwhile, the disciples walked with Jesus without fully grasping what was about to happen. And in the middle of all this, a story unfolds that brings together expectation, tension, betrayal, suffering, and fulfillment. Today you're going to understand Holy Week as a real timeline, day by day, moment by moment. Not just what happened, but why it happened, how it unfolded in practice, and what the Bible actually reveals in each scene. Because when you connect all the events, the story stops feeling fragmented and becomes something much deeper. Each day reveals a detail that many people overlook. Every scene adds another piece to the bigger picture. And by the end, the cross is no longer seen the same way. If this kind of content helps you understand the Bible more clearly, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and be part of these studies. And before we continue, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's go back to where it all began. It all begins with a scene that at first glance looks like a celebration, but in reality carries a much deeper contrast. Jesus approaches Jerusalem. This is not a random entrance. According to the Gospel accounts, there is clear intention behind every detail. He sends 2 of his disciples ahead to bring a axel-gazerda donkey, an animal that had never been ridden. This is not a minor detail, because it directly connects to an ancient prophecy found in the scriptures, where it is written that the king would come humble, riding on a donkey. From the very beginning, this moment already had meaning. As Jesus enters the city, the reaction is immediate. The crowd begins to spread their cloaks on the road. Others cut branches from trees, and together they shout, "Hosanna to the Son of David." The word Hosanna was not just a celebration, it was a plea. Save us now. And here is where the first key insight appears. The people did believe Jesus was someone significant. Many recognized him as the Messiah. But their understanding of the Messiah was not necessarily the same as what Jesus came to fulfill. They were expecting a political deliverer, someone who would confront Roman power, restore Israel's kingdom, and establish visible authority. But Jesus enters in a completely different way. He does not come on a war horse, but on an animal associated with humility. He is not surrounded by soldiers, but by ordinary people. He does not raise a weapon. He brings a message. And this is where the meaning of the scene begins to shift. Because while the crowd celebrates, Jesus observes. The Gospel of Luke records a powerful detail. As he approaches Jerusalem, Jesus weeps over the city. He is not carried away by the excitement of the moment. He sees something others do not. He knows what is coming. He knows that the same city shouting "Hosanna" will, in just a few days, call for his crucifixion. This changes everything. What looks like a moment of triumph is actually the beginning of a path toward sacrifice. From a practical perspective, Jerusalem at that time was full. It was Passover season, one of the most important feasts for the Jewish people. Thousands of pilgrims were arriving from different regions. The city was crowded, highly active, and also under heightened tension. So this entrance does not go unnoticed. The Gospel of Matthew says the entire city is stirred. A question begins to spread. Who is this? And the answer reveals something important. This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. It's interesting, because while they recognize him, there is still only a partial understanding of who he truly is. Meanwhile, on another level, the religious leaders are watching. For them, this is not a celebration. It is a warning sign. Jesus' influence is growing. The crowds are following him, and that represents a risk, not only religious, but also political in the eyes of Roman authority. This is where a more direct conflict begins to form. Because what is happening here is not just a spiritual event. It carries social, cultural, and power implications. After entering Jerusalem, Jesus goes to the temple, and this detail is essential. The temple was the center of everything: worship, teaching, authority. And when Jesus arrives, he does not act like a passive visitor. He observes. The Gospel of Mark tells us that he enters, looks around at everything, and then leaves, because it is already late. This small detail opens an important window into what will happen next. Jesus does not react impulsively. He evaluates. He sees what is happening inside the temple, and what he finds there sets the stage for the next day. Because what seemed like a symbolic entrance was actually the beginning of a much deeper confrontation. The city has been stirred, the crowd has responded, the leaders are alert, and Jesus has seen enough. But while everyone is trying to interpret what is happening, something quieter is beginning to unfold. Because not everyone close to Jesus is thinking the same way. And as tension begins to rise in Jerusalem, someone very close to him is already moving toward a decision that will change everything. What began as a symbolic entrance quickly turns into a series of actions that raise the tension to an entirely different level. The next day, Jesus returns to the temple, but this time, he does not simply observe, he acts. The Gospels describe a powerful scene. As he enters, he finds people selling animals, money changers conducting business, transactions happening inside a space that was meant for prayer. And in that moment, if something happens that challenges the image many had of him, Jesus overturns the tables. He drives out those who were selling, and he declares with authority that this place was meant to be a house of prayer, but had been turned into a den of thieves. To understand the full weight of this moment, we need to look at the context. The temple was not only a spiritual center, it was also an economic system. Sacrifices required specific animals, and many travelers couldn't bring them from long distances, so they purchased them there. There was also currency exchange, since not all coins were accepted for offerings. In other words, what was happening had a practical function, but over time, that system had been distorted. Prices could be excessive, practices could be unjust, and what was meant to facilitate worship had become a barrier to it. Jesus' reaction is not impulsive, it is a direct response to a deep corruption, and the impact is immediate, because he is not only interrupting business, he is challenging authority. From that moment on, opposition intensifies. The chief priests and scribes begin actively looking for a way to eliminate him. This is no longer just disagreement, it becomes intention. But there is a complication. The crowd. The biblical text shows that many people were amazed by his teaching. Jesus did not teach like the others. There was authority in his words. And because of that, the leaders could not act openly without risking a public reaction. So the tension becomes strategic. During these days, Jesus continues teaching in the temple. And something important happens here. He doesn't just teach, he confronts. He speaks in parables that expose the hypocrisy of the religious leaders. He responds to questions designed to trap him. Different groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, experts in the law, approach him, each trying to discredit him publicly. They question him about taxes, about the resurrection, about the law. But every time, Jesus responds with clarity, precision, and a level of understanding that goes beyond expectations. And this creates two simultaneous effects. On one hand, the people are even more amazed. On the other, the leaders feel increasingly threatened, because it's no longer just about what Jesus is doing. It's about what he represents. He is exposing flaws in a system that had been established for years. He is pointing out inconsistencies. He is revealing a form of outward religion that had lost its essence. And all of this is happening in public. During these same days, there are also warnings. Jesus speaks about the future, about judgment, about the need to be ready. His teachings carry a sense of urgency, as if time is moving toward a decisive moment. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, plans are forming. The leaders are looking for a way to arrest him quietly. They cannot do it during the day, not in front of the crowd. They need the right moment, and this is where a critical element enters the story. Someone from within, Judas Iscariot. The Gospels reveal that he goes to the chief priests and offers to hand Jesus over. This is no random arrest anymore. Now there is inside information. someone who knows Jesus' movements, someone who knows where he goes, when he is alone, how to approach without drawing attention. And this changes everything, because now the conflict is no longer only external, it becomes internal. While Jesus continues teaching, while the crowd continues listening, while the leaders continue planning, the betrayal is already in motion. 30 pieces of silver seal the agreement, and from that moment on, Judas begins to look for the perfect opportunity to act. Everything seems to move quietly, but with direction. The city remains full. Activity continues. Teachings continue. But beneath the surface, every piece is falling into place, and what began as tension is now approaching an unavoidable breaking point, because the next gathering will not be public. It will be private. A table, a small group, a meal that appears to be part of tradition, but will, in reality, mark a turning point in history, and in that moment, everything will be revealed. After days of rising tension, public teaching, and hidden plans, the story now shifts into a much more intimate setting. We are no longer in the middle of crowds. Now we are inside a house, around a table, sharing a meal that for the Jewish people carried deep meaning: the Passover. This detail is essential. Passover was not just a dinner. It was a remembrance of Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt. Every element on the table had meaning: the bread, the wine, the herbs. Each one pointed back to a moment when God intervened powerfully in the history of his people. And it is in this exact setting that Jesus begins to redefine everything. Before the meal fully unfolds, something unexpected happens. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus rises from the table, takes a towel, and begins to wash his disciples' feet. This was not symbolic in their culture. It was a task reserved for the lowest servant in the household. And yet, he does it himself, one by one. This act is not only about humility, it establishes a principle. At a moment when everything seems to be building toward power or confrontation, Jesus speaks through action about service, surrender, and practical love. Peter reacts. He doesn't understand. He struggles to accept that his teacher would do something like this. But Jesus makes it clear that this moment carries a deeper meaning, one they will understand later. The meal continues, and in the middle of it, Jesus introduces something entirely new. He takes the bread, breaks it, and connects it to his body. He takes the cup and links it to his blood, not as an isolated symbol, but as the foundation of a new covenant. This is a turning point, because Passover had always pointed back to a past deliverance, but now Jesus is pointing forward to something that is about to happen, a different kind of deliverance, not political, not external, but spiritual. As they sit together at the table sharing this moment, Jesus makes a statement that changes the atmosphere completely. "One of you will betray me." The room shifts. Silence settles in. The disciples begin to look at one another, asking, "Is it me?" There is no immediate suspicion directed at a single person. This reveals something important. At least on the surface, Judas did not stand out from the rest. But Jesus knows. The gospel accounts show that he identifies the betrayer in a subtle way. He does not expose him publicly in that moment. There is a quiet interaction, and then Judas leaves. And here, a small detail carries deep meaning. The Gospel of John says that when Judas went out, it was night, not just in a literal sense, but in what it represents. From that moment forward, everything begins to accelerate. After the meal, Jesus and his disciples go out to the Mount of Olives, to a place called Gethsemane. This was not a random location. It was a place they had gone to before, and that is exactly why Judas knows where to find him. When they arrive, Jesus separates himself slightly from the group, and here we see something deeply human. He prays. The Gospels describe an intense moment. This is not a routine prayer. There is weight. There is anguish. Jesus is fully aware of what is about to happen, and in that moment, he expresses both his humanity and his obedience. "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Meanwhile, the disciples fall asleep. The contrast is striking. At the moment of greatest emotional weight, those closest to him cannot stay awake. Jesus wakes them, speaks to them, returns to pray, and this pattern repeats, until suddenly, everything changes. Lights in the darkness, Voices approaching. Judas arrives, not alone, but accompanied by a group sent by the religious leaders. They come prepared to arrest Jesus. And then comes a moment that has been portrayed many times, but carries a deeper weight when seen closely. Judas approaches and identifies Jesus with a kiss. That was the signal. A gesture that normally expressed affection, now used as an act of betrayal. Jesus does not run. He does not hide. He does not resist with violence. Instead, he steps forward. One of the disciples attempts to defend him, but Jesus stops it. This is not the way. And in a matter of moments, everything shifts. The teacher is arrested. The disciples scatter. The night moves forward, and with it, the beginning of a rapid silhouette of events that will not slow down. What had been preparation, teaching, and warning now becomes execution. Because from this point on, there is no turning back. And as the early hours of the morning approach, Jesus will be taken from one place to another, facing accusations, trials, and decisions that had already been set in motion. The betrayal is complete. And what comes next will lead the story into its darkest moment. If this content is helping you understand the Bible in a clearer and deeper way, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That allows us to keep creating this kind of content and reach more people. And now I'd like to hear from you. Had you already seen this sequence of Jesus' final days? Or did something surprise you? After the arrest in Gethsemane, the story enters a phase where everything begins to move quickly, yet with increasing intensity. Jesus is first taken before the religious authorities. This is not a formal trial in the way it would normally be expected. It happens during the night, which already raises questions, even within the context of that time. He is brought before the high priest, and the interrogations begin. They look for testimony. They try to build a solid accusation, but there is a problem. The accounts don't agree. The Gospels show that false witnesses come forward, people attempting to construct a case against him, but their statements fail to align consistently. Even so, the objective does not change. They are not searching for truth. They are searching for a reason to condemn him. In the middle of this tension, Jesus remains silent for much of the process. This detail is striking. He does not defend himself in the expected way. He does not engage in arguments. He does not attempt to dismantle every accusation. There is a calmness that contrasts sharply with the chaos around him, until a direct question is asked. The high priest asks him plainly if he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And then, Jesus answers, not with ambiguity, and not with avoidance, but clearly. And that changes everything. Because from the perspective of the religious leaders, this statement is enough to accuse him of blasphemy. They no longer need additional witnesses. They have what they were looking for. The decision, at least on their side, is made. From that moment on, the situation intensifies. Jesus is mocked. He is mistreated. He is rejected. The same night that began with a shared meal now turns into a scene of complete abandonment. And at the same time, another story is unfolding nearby. Peter, one of the closest disciples, follows at a distance. He wants to see what will happen. He stays near the place where Jesus is being questioned. But the environment is tense. People begin to recognize him. They point him out as someone who was with Jesus. And then something happens that Jesus had already predicted. Peter denies him, not once, but 3 times. Each denial becomes stronger, more definite. And at the moment the rooster crows, Peter remembers what Jesus had said, and he understands. This moment reveals something deeply human: fear, confusion, weakness. While Jesus faces the process directly, one of his closest followers cannot stand firm in that moment, and the night continues to move forward. After the religious trial, Jesus is taken before the Roman authorities. Here, another layer of power enters the scene: political authority. Because the religious leaders did not have the power to carry out a death sentence under Roman rule. They needed the case to be approved by a governor, so they bring Jesus before Pilate. And now the focus shifts. The accusations are reframed in political terms, no longer only about blasphemy, but about someone claiming to be a king, which could be seen as a threat to Rome. Pilate questions Jesus. He tries to understand the situation. The gospel accounts indicate that he does not find clear guilt in him. There is even an attempt to avoid condemning him. Pilate proposes releasing him, following a custom during Passover. But the pressure begins to rise. The crowd, now influenced by the religious leaders, starts demanding the release of another prisoner and the crucifixion of Jesus. And here, the contrast becomes undeniable. The same city that welcomed him with celebration is now participating in the decision that will lead him to the cross. Pilate eventually gives in, not necessarily out of conviction, but under pressure. And with that, the sentence is set. Before the crucifixion, Jesus is subjected to physical punishment, mockery, and humiliation. Roman soldiers take part in this process, treating him as someone who claimed to be a king, but in a mocking, ironic way. They place a robe on him, a crown on his head, not as honor, but as ridicule, and all of this unfolds as the morning begins to rise. What started as a quiet arrest in the night has now become a public condemnation. The decision has been made, the path is defined, and what comes next will not be another trial. It will be an execution, because as the day begins, Jesus will be led outside the city, and every step from this point forward will bring him closer to the most decisive moment of this entire story. With the sentence now established, the story reaches its most decisive point. Jesus is handed over to be crucified. This is not just a transfer of custody. It is the beginning of a process already defined within the Roman system. Crucifixion was a public form of execution, designed not only to punish, but to expose, to warn, and to send a clear message. And it begins with the journey. Jesus is led outside the city toward a place called Golgotha, meaning the place of the skull. According to the gospel accounts, he carries the cross, or part of it, along the way. The physical exhaustion is evident, to the point that a man named Simon of Cyrene is compelled to help carry it. This detail matters because it shows that this was not symbolic. It was physical, visible, demanding. When they arrive at the location, the crucifixion takes place. Jesus is nailed to the cross. The Gospels do not focus on describing every physical detail, but they make clear the weight of the moment, not only because of the suffering, but because of what is happening on a deeper level. Above his head, an inscription is placed, King of the Jews. For some, it is meant as mockery, but at the same time, it declares a truth many still do not understand. Jesus is not alone. 2 others are crucified beside him, and this also carries meaning within the biblical narrative. He is counted among transgressors, just as the scriptures had foretold. While he is on the cross, the Gospels record several statements, not many, but each one carries weight. He speaks about forgiveness. He speaks to one of the men beside him. He addresses his mother. He expresses what is taking place. And finally, he declares completion. It is finished. This does not sound like defeat. It sounds like fulfillment, like something has reached the exact point for which it was intended. From noon until the afternoon, the Gospels describe darkness covering the land, not as a random detail, but as something that accompanies the moment. And then, Jesus dies. But even here, the story does not end in silence. There are reactions. The veil of the temple is torn. A Roman centurion recognizes that something extraordinary has happened. Those who are watching begin to process what they have just witnessed. And this leads us to something essential, because what happened on the cross was not simply the end of Jesus' life. It was the fulfillment of everything that had been unfolding throughout that week. From the entrance into Jerusalem to this exact moment, nothing was out of place. Nothing happened by accident. Each day built toward this point. And even though from a human perspective it looks like the end, the story is not over, because the silence that follows is not permanent. It is a pause, and what comes next will give even deeper meaning to everything that has just taken place. After walking through each of these days carefully, Holy Week is no longer just a collection of isolated moments. It becomes a complete sequence, intentional, precise, and deeply meaningful. These were not disconnected events. This was a path. From the moment Jesus entered Jerusalem, welcomed as a king, yet not the kind of king people expected, through the days of confrontation, where he exposed what was broken, to a private dinner where he redefined the meaning of Passover, and finally, to a night of betrayal, an unjust trial, and a cross. Every step had purpose. Every day moved in a clear direction. And when you connect it all, the original question finds its answer. What really happened during Holy Week? A plan was fulfilled, step by step. This was not a reaction to circumstances. It was not an accident within history. It was the unfolding of something already established within the message of the Bible, a work pointing toward salvation, toward the love of God, and toward a hope that goes beyond that moment. The cross, then, is not simply the end of a life. It is the center of the story, a moment where human decisions, betrayal, fear, pressure, injustice, intersect with a greater purpose that continues moving forward even through all of it. And this is where the story shifts. Because it is no longer just something to observe, it becomes something to consider. Understanding what happened in each of those days is not only about knowing the timeline, it is about understanding the meaning behind it. It is about recognizing that even when everything seemed out of control, there was direction, that even in the middle of rejection, there was purpose, and that every detail was leading toward fulfillment. Holy Week reveals this with clarity. It shows how what appears to be defeat can carry a deeper meaning. It shows how every moment matters, and it leaves us with a question that is no longer about the past, but about the present. What does this mean for you today? Where does this story fit in your life? Because in the end, it is not just about understanding what happened. It is about what you do with what you now understand. If this journey helped you see the Bible with more clarity and depth, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That helps this message reach more people who are also searching for understanding. And now I'd really like to hear from you. Which moment from this week impacted you the most, and why? Because sometimes, one detail is enough to change the way we see everything. May this story strengthen your faith and remind you that every detail carries purpose.